Welcome to the What's Your Ceiling podcast. We're your hosts, Monte Wyatt and Paul Szynski. Wherever you are in life, there is a higher ceiling. This podcast is how you become aware of it and how to take action to push through it. It's time to discover your ceiling. Welcome to the What's Your Ceiling podcast, where we talk about your health, your family, your business. I'm Monte Wyatt.
I'm Paul Szynski.
And we've got a great episode today. We're going to learn a lot about an organization that everybody knows about, and we're going to learn some of the behind the scenes secrets and some of the things that are just interesting to learning about how a company grew and how it impacted people's lives. And so with that, I want to start with kind of a theme for the day. Theme for the day is how much is enough. So Paul, when you hear the phrase how much is enough, what comes to mind?
You know, it's really interesting because we haven't really talked about this concept, but because we're all about health, family, and business and breaking through different ceilings. But when you run it at a high level and I think a high awareness, which we also talk about the awareness factor, I think you find out what that limit is. And I think everybody reaches at high levels. And we're fortunate enough today that someone that's been up in that 5% level that a lot of people never get to. So it's great to have an individual like this to talk a little bit about what is enough and what limits. So this could be a great interview today. I'm looking forward to it.
I love how you put that. It's how much is enough. It's about your limit and what are you willing to do or not do to move forward. Because I think we all have our breaking points of what we're willing to do or what we're not willing to do.
And sometimes I think it's not only really your limit, because I think we're all unlimited, but I think it is at this part of your life and achieve it at a high level, and then you want to decide to go to a different challenge in your life, and I think that's a big part of it, and I think that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, and that's something that I think as business people and entrepreneurs, we all battle. You know, what are we here for? What are we going to do? We've maxed out this part of our life. It's time to go to another level.
Yeah.
To another form of growth, I would say.
And like you said, that how much is enough at that point in your life? How much is enough at that point of your career? And so it is a limit of what am I willing to give? What am I willing to give?
It is, and there's so much money you want to make. There's so many cars you're going to own. There's so much real estate you can own, and then how much. I think value. It comes down to value, and I think we all want to be put value in our life, and which gets back to what is going to be our legacy.
So I'm looking forward to our conversation because I think our guest is going to share a little bit about how much is enough of what you're willing to give of yourself and what it does to you mentally. And so, Paul, if you would introduce our guest today.
Well, our guest today, we were lucky to have here originally from Iowa. She graduated from Palo Central and went to Chicago, went to San Francisco, and joined eBay and helped grow one of the fastest growing companies back in the 90s. And I'd like to introduce to you Kellie Markey. Kellie, we are great to have you here, and we're going to have a great interview today. I was fortunate enough to listen to Kellie speak here a little over a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago now, and talk about some of her passions. And I thought, man, if she would ever get a chance to get on our podcast, she'd be the lady we'd want on there. But kind of tell us a little bit about what you got going on and kind of how you started out in the business world. Because we have people out here we call the achievers, and then we like to talk about what ceilings you ran into and from when you started and where we're at today.
Yeah, so I started my career in advertising and marketing in Chicago. And I think what is interesting in that industry back in the 80s was that women were not in executive positions. A lot of women work in the industry at lower levels. And there are no old people who work in that business, which was always very interesting to me. It's like, that must be achievable to me at some point because nobody else is old. And if I just hold on long enough, But it's a very work-oriented environment. You work around the clock. You're very dedicated to your company and your clients. And so there's a bit of burnout in that space that I think contributes to why people don't stay in those positions, and oftentimes goes company side versus staying in marketing organizations, which isn't exactly what happened to me, but certainly looking at where the opportunities were based on what history said they were.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Okay, we're talking the 90s, right?
Late 80s and 90s.
90s.
Yep.
So you graduate. Do you move to Chicago at that point?
I went to Chicago in the last semester of my college year for an urban studies program and was placed in an internship, a full-time internship in my field during that time, and just never went back.
You didn't even go back for your graduation, is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
So you go to Chicago as an intern, your last semester in college, and never come back. And it's advertisement and
direct marketing. Yep.
Direct marketing. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And you're there for a period of time. And I believe at that point you go to San Francisco and come back. Tell us a little bit about that transition and how you end up at eBay.
Yeah, so I was in an organization called Ogilvy and Mather Direct in Chicago. And during that time, very interestingly, a younger man was hired in the same company that I was and accelerated faster than I did. And he had relationships, or his family had relationships with management. And there were a lot of elements to his progression that seemed very unfair to me. And so, after 3 years inside of one agency as a very young person, at a time when this industry was moving away from like the 3 martini lunch and the relationships at the high levels and the social aspects of this industry, it was becoming more and more professional. It felt like if I was going to make an impact and grow my career, I was going to have to make a change on where I worked. And so I put out some feelers and got a job at Foote Belding in San Francisco, where I went for 5 years and, had a much more diverse set, a much different set of clients, more technology clients, more, just outside of retail. In Chicago, it was Kraft Foods, and it was Blue Cross Blue Shield, and then it was 3Com, and just a really different set. And during that time, I had an opportunity to go work client side and worked inside of a company, Pacific Telesis, and found that it is not nearly as exciting. They hold the purse and they hold the responsibility and decision making, but the work isn't as creative and dynamic and as fast paced.
It's interesting. So you leave this advertising. Now, what was the reason that you went to San Francisco? What you had spent some time there. You liked that area? What drew you to San Francisco?
I had never been there before, but I was only interested in career advancement. And I actually quite liked living in Chicago as a young person. It was a fun place to live, but I went there just for the job.
Right. And then, okay. Now, we're going to get into, you're the 189th person hired at eBay, which I find fascinating because the business was, 3 years old at the time then? Or?
We were just post-IPO at the time, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And how did you get the job? And what drew you to eBay?
Yeah, I mean, it was really, again, just an opportunity to advance my career. I had gone back to Chicago and was not super interested in working inside of a marketing organization like I had done before. And so at the time, I was also getting my MBA. And so I wasn't as committed to growing my career at the time, but at the end of 3 years, my then husband and I made a decision to leave Chicago. And so I literally just put some feelers out to a headhunter, and I knew I didn't want to probably go to another agency. And so that's when the opportunity to interview with eBay came up.
So, you were stating that your career, was about your career. So you were obviously a goal setter. Kind of give me your frame of how you did that. Some people have vision boards, some people write them down. How did you articulate that?
The only way that I can really describe it at the time, because I probably was not cerebral enough to think through the big picture in the midst of all of it going on, but it was just climbing the ladder. How fast and how far can I get up the ladder compared to everybody else? And I don't even know how much there was comparison, but for me personally, to feel like I have a very strong achievement orientation and like challenges and problem solving. And the challenge at eBay that was so appealing to me was there was no marketing. It was all engineers at the time. And so as the first marketing hire, I just felt like it was a playground of things to figure out, where there was no one telling me how to figure it out or what to figure out, but to put the plan together.
That's interesting because, so you get hired basically at a very high level, really, when you went into that, because they gave you the creative power to do what you wanted.
Well, they gave me the creative power to do what I wanted, except as long as I didn't touch the infrastructure. So when I joined eBay, my job was to communicate with our installed base of customers and to understand who they were and what their needs were. And eBay at the time was sending 1 million emails a week in outbid notices and, final win notices, registration emails, all of these things. And so my belief was I'm going to understand our database and then target communications through these emails that are already going out. And then I arrive and it's like, oh no, you can't touch those because the technology is too unstable and we're not adding anything on top of it than just the business. And so it was about 18 months before we were able to roll out any programming that leveraged the existing infrastructure of email sending, which is what eBay does for a living. They send emails to people. Right. And so it was all outsourced. But really there was no marketing strategy. There was no database segmentation. There was no understanding of what people did on that site to grow the business after they registered.
Tell us a little bit about the culture of eBay and what that looked like, and with that few of employees, knowing how fast it was growing, and how that impacted relationships and how that impacted your work.
Yeah, it was a 5-year window for me, and the amount of change that happened in that period of time inside of one company was just unknown. The rate of change. And so when I joined, we didn't have a facilities group. We didn't have an HR group. We had engineers and business development people who were doing web deals, ad sales deals. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of an island unto my own and building a team in marketing. And so the focus and orientation of the organization at the time was on engineering and on the infrastructure. And so everything else was secondary. And as we started to grow, we started to learn a lot more about how eBay is successful across categories. So I don't know if most people know, but at the time and probably still today, automotive parts is the biggest category on eBay. So we had category managers and then subcategory managers across all of those things that were being sold on the site. And all of these people who were brought in to be product and category managers were business degrees from Stanford and from Harvard who had never worked in a company before. And so they brought a lot of belief systems from what they learned about culture in a book, but had never applied it with human beings. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up having many, many cultures that were trying to work together and, with no sort of sense of, we all had a common purpose of making money for the machine, but not an approach to doing it that was similar across the organization. And by my third year, those things were really starting to develop inside the company. And, we grew, we added buildings, and the way that was all done just helped to create the alignment that exists today.
Yeah. I really enjoyed when we were talking earlier, we call it the green room, but you talked about your first day and how you had to set up your office.
Yeah, so the cubes that we worked in, so we had 2 floors in a office park, in a building of 6 buildings in an office park that eBay eventually acquired the entire office park during my time there. And your first day, you found a place to sort of carve out as your own, and you maybe had cube walls, or you maybe stacked up some books to create an area. But you went across the street to Staples to buy your chair and assemble your chair on the first day. So you'd have a place to sit, because there was nobody whose job it was to help you have a place to sit.
That few people that you just had to do it yourself, and you had to set up your own desk.
Everybody was an engineer or in business development.
Yep.
And that's who people paid attention to. And, the personalities are these, especially in business development, are these, sort of young bucks who, have no fear and are out there. One of the guys I remember would wear the same shirt every day until he closed a deal. And everybody knew what deal he was working on, and, knew how the thing was progressing based on the sort of quality of his shirt.
That's pretty cool. Now,
it was fun.
You guys you basically lived in your offices. Is that correct?
At work, yeah.
How did that work? What was your hours, your weeks? And then you eventually, I know you went overseas and set up eBay all over the world. And as a woman back then, you're breaking new ground. And that was really neat. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the culture was definitely, commitment and marriage to work. And so your hours during, so I and many of my coworkers, kind of would work out in the mornings before we started our days, and would see each other on the trails and in the locker rooms and stuff between 5 and 6 in the morning. And by 6:30, you're at your desk, and there's kind of an accounting to it. Who's there first? And, there were a couple of, senior executives, who also were in those areas and kind of just keeping track. And you knew they were kind of keeping track. Mm-hmm. Oh, you didn't work out today. Or, you didn't make it in until 7 o'clock or something like that. There was always an accounting of it. And, we were there, between 7 and 9 at night on weekdays. And then Saturdays were a work day. And you might work 6 to 8 hours on a Saturday. And then Sunday you showed up at some point and, I don't know, just made an appearance. And hopefully were seen because the accounting was going on.
Right.
And then you'd be sure in the following week to comment on the meeting that you had Sunday afternoon with such and such, in order to make sure you were being counted. And to say that I grew eBay around the world is a grand overstatement, because when I joined eBay International, I was managing eBay companies that already existed, or companies that eBay had investments in those regions. Mm-hmm. And as a woman in those space, the opportunity was very, very different, because women in Taiwan are regarded much more highly in business than in Korea, South Korea, for example, where a senior executive man won't even report to a woman. So our country manager in South Korea would not report to me. And so it was kind of like this, okay, he will report to my boss, who is a man. And, in order to manage the cultural issues in these countries, you worked around those things. But it was very dynamic for sure. And it was very different by each culture that we operated in.
So tell us a little bit about, our show is What's Your Ceiling, and breaking through new things. What was one of the biggest challenges or biggest risks that you had to push through during that time, whichever position it was within eBay, but, being an early employee to all the way to 8,000 employees? Tell us a big challenge that you broke through.
I mean, every day was one of them at the time, because there was nothing that came before you to determine whether it was good or right or wrong. And so you were, as someone who was driving the installed base marketing for a company like that, everything that we presented was competing against every other thing in the entire organization, whether it's opening a country in Germany or a marketing program. It all required engineering, and we all had to leverage engineering train seats and make a compelling case for why we needed to do this and why the company needed. So it was a lot of internal sort of grappling for resources in order to do the next most important thing. And so I think for me, and especially as a woman, and as a woman who probably suffers as much with imposter syndrome as anyone does, and certainly when I was younger, is, to advocate for myself and to have the confidence to know what I was talking about and to really believe that I knew the answer to what was next, and to then exhibit that to people who were going to judge me on that. And so I am a very risk-tolerant person, and so those things never felt hard to me necessarily. But I found that oftentimes asking forgiveness rather than permission was the best way through. So I was undertaking an enormous project on data segmentation on eBay, and had many of my staff working on segmentation strategies and testing different models in order to make this proposal to eBay that nobody was thinking about or why it was important or understood. But you go far enough in order to make the proof of concept, really, an allocation of resources that maybe isn't really part of what you're doing. But we had a lot of people who worked a lot of hours, so it was up to me to decide. And so forgiveness rather than permission in order to get to that proof of concept where you could really advocate for what you wanted to do.
Paul, I want to reinforce something to our audience, the achiever. You really mentioned that every day was a new path.
Yeah.
And it was a clear slate every single day, and you had to take risks. You had to think differently. You had to fight for resources. You had to build your team and work with others, engineers, to get that. And I think that's a powerful thing, that as achievers, we have to wake up every day that it's a new sheet of paper.
That's exactly right.
It's a brand new path that we're breaking ground on.
Well, it's exactly, the same as the industry that I ended up in, human services, right? 180 degrees away from what I was doing before, but there's no rule book for it. There was no model to follow in order to change the way that we think about care for people in crisis. And so what I believe is why we have found some level of success in what we do is not being afraid to ask for forgiveness and to try things and to apply things and then to adapt and refine and do all of the things that make it really good, but get out there and just try.
I want to hear a couple more stories. And you spent 5 years at eBay, and tell us what made you leave, and then kind of your experiences after that of what you went through as recovery, so to speak, from eBay.
Yeah, so after 2 years in international, where I traveled year-round and spent more time out of the country than in the country, I started feeling very sort of untethered and like a person without a place. And inside of eBay, it was very common to move senior management around to give them experience in leadership across the entire organization. And so I was being presented with an opportunity to go to Dublin in our customer support organization and kind of start something up there. And I worked very closely with our customer support organization because a lot of marketing programs drive customer support. And it was very compelling to me, but coming out of the international experience and this feeling of being a person without a place, I just started asking myself questions about what's next for me. And you talked in the beginning about limits and things like this, but I think the thing that came up for me during that time is, what else do I have to contribute? And if I take this turn, am I going to be making a contribution at the highest level of my ability and in a way that is most productive for this company, or is it just the next thing on the list for them? And that's where it kind of came down for me, because I loved my first job at eBay. I kind of liked my second job at eBay. I wasn't really looking forward to the next level. And so I came upon the question of how much is enough? How much do I have to earn for this company? How much do I have to prove myself as, a leader in this company? How much money do I have to make in order to be considered a successful person inside and outside of the company? And I had decided it was enough.
That's a little bit of a self-awareness, I think, to be able to set back and take that, how much is enough is enough. Monte, you work with people all over the country and you deal with this. I know you deal with this all the time, but I guess I haven't come to that question, how much is enough? Of course, my wife says that to me all the time, but I'm glad you brought that up, because you're a person that takes on challenges, and I think probably you felt you've met so many challenges at that level. So what happened, and the question Monte asks is, what happens after you're done with eBay and your next challenge?
Yeah, so really where that questioning led is, what do I have to contribute? So, I did this really big thing, and I felt like I had successfully, achieved a career in advertising and marketing prior to that. So what's next? And what's it going to look like? Because it's probably not going to look like everything else I've already done. And so when I actually left eBay, I didn't have a plan I wasn't jumping into my next career. I was going to take some time and work through it, and had such a crisis of identity in terms of my own personal elevator pitch. So who am I, Kellie Markey, if I'm not Kellie Markey, Vice President, Corporate Communications at eBay, with this much revenue responsibility, this much management responsibility? I literally felt like I didn't deserve my patch of ground on the earth without the level of productivity that I was accustomed to delivering in a community.
You mentioned the phrase imposter syndrome before, and I think that's a lot of what you're talking about, is that belief of I'm not good enough, or what's the next step,
or who you are is
Yes.
based on what you do.
Correct.
And that was a real turning point for me, because what I knew is, in order to continue to evolve as a human being, I had to answer that question before I decided what I was going to do next.
Yeah. Who am I before what do I do?
Right.
I love that. Very good. So tell us how you broke through that challenge, that mental aspect of who am I before what do I do?
So a lot of therapy, a lot of personal development, a lot of reading, a lot of self-help stuff. And I played a lot of golf with my dad and his buddies. And so having the opportunity to reconnect with my family, and especially my parents, as an adult and more as a friend, and to have a lot of fun and a lot of free time, ended up just being delightful. And I didn't ever know that before, that free time could be good. And it's like, I was so worried. It's like, I'm going to wake up in the morning, like I better sleep longer because I'm not going to have anything to do all day. And then you realize that your day gets filled up in beautiful, delightful ways that you don't always anticipate. And it was okay.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Hey, Kellie, I want to ask real quick. You talk about, building up your mental power. You talked about books. What would you recommend to achievers out there, that maybe a mental book and a business book that you read that you felt helped you?
Yeah, so one of the books that I love, Crucial Conversations, is just... It's interesting because the word conversation is in the title, but the book is all about listening in order to be effective in conversations, and in order to manage conversations in a way that works for both sides of the conversation. And I just thought that book was just so compelling in this process. And, a lot of the Habits of Highly Effective People, right? Really interesting book and concept around doing that. And I started moving more towards books more aligned to human services, and one of the best ones I ever read in that space was When Helping Hurts, which has really become a Bible of mine because it's more about not enabling people, but helping empower people to help themselves. And so all kinds of books.
Oh, that's great.
Awesome.
Thank goodness I remember the names of all of them. It's
I
like
didn't
I
mean to
felt
put
like
you
I
on
was
the
on the
spot
spot.
there, but
I want you to tell us more about what you're doing today.
Yeah.
Because you're making a huge impact in the world and in the community here. And I want you to tell that story of how you got started and what kind of impact you're making.
Yeah, so when I moved back to Des Moines, I was very disconnected from this community, and philanthropy was an area of focus, that I thought might be a good fit for me to shift the direction of my ladder and what it was leaning up to, because I very much believe that in our society, we spend a third of our life learning, a third of it earning, and a third of it returning. And if their eyes are opened to the opportunity and the rewards of returning, of giving back to a community when they're learning, and if they don't stop learning when they start working and they become lifetime learners, the richness of the combinations of those things is so much better. Mm-hmm. And so teaching kids at a young age the power of giving and the importance of giving back, and lifetime learning for me is just part of who I am. And so to go into human services, there was divine inspiration. There was a lot of things that led to it that sort of tricked me into going into what I'm doing. But I believe that every experience that I had and all the professional development that I had was designed to prepare me for opening Dorothy's House. And so I had such a wide range of experiences that I wasn't afraid to start a business outside of my scope of knowledge that had a lot of controls in it and a lot of things about it that bothered me, that I wasn't afraid to change or to at least consider the idea of changing. And so I was flipping homes when I first came back to Des Moines as kind of a hobby job, which I loved. I kind of thought I'd get a TV show, but that's much harder than it looks. And but I really did enjoy, and it was during a time of a lot of foreclosures in the market. And so I flipped 13 homes in 2 years in my neighborhood. And one day tripped over a house that would have been a terrible decision for a flip. I had a foster child in my care and her 2-year-old daughter in my care at the time. So there was a lot of chaos in my life, a lot of change. And I went to see this house, and in the process of walking from the back door into the front of the house on October 13 of 2013, the sun is shining through these beautiful stained glass windows. And I bought the house without going upstairs, or offered to, and named it that day. Huh. And I went to the person who was the director at the organization I was on the board at the time, and kind of shared in a one-pager what I thought my concept was. And he's crying, and he said, any way we can help you to achieve this, we will do that. And so that's kind of what set the course for me next.
So tell us more about what's the purpose of Dorothy's House and the impact that you're having.
Yeah, our mission is to be a safe place for what we call the practice of life for those whose lives have been interrupted by human trafficking, exploitation, and prostitution. So for a group of individuals who are the most harmed individuals in our community, modern day slavery, and the manipulation that goes into it, as well as the adversity that makes people vulnerable to it, means that most of these people are growing up in fight or flight. Mm-hmm. So they're not at 10 years old going with their aunt to set up their first passbook at the bank. We have women who have never really learned how to use silverware appropriately or be in a public setting, with the right etiquette. And so there were so many tools that these people lost. We rarely ever talk about the trafficking and the trauma in their day-to-day, but we give them opportunities to learn the things they missed when they were younger in order to reimagine a future. And so it's a 2-year long-term recovery program that we built over, we've been open for 8 years now, and it has been a constant evolution because we learn something new from every survivor who comes through our program.
Yeah, it takes on a lot of fundraising, getting the right people,
processes, hiring, culture, all of the things.
You were built for that, so it was meant to happen. That's great.
And I would say it takes a lot of mental strength as well.
Yeah. I mean, I would say for the first 4.5 years, I felt like I carried this thing on my back and I forced it to work before. You think maybe a startup, you give yourself 3 years in a space so unknown that we were going into. I said, okay, maybe more than 3 years before you pull the plug on it. And by the end of our 4th year, things were starting to move. We had a curriculum that we felt really good about. Staffing became less volatile. We got through COVID. So we had overcome so much, and we're still going strong. So.
Just from 10,000 feet, something like that you're in, and you've been in this space now for almost 10 years, probably education for the public is probably one of the most, it probably helps more than anything else.
Still today.
Because
yeah.
A lot of people, when I heard you speak here a couple of years ago, I didn't realize it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And but I think the more and more people are more aware of it, it's in our neighborhoods, and we don't realize it. So, but I think the more people are educated, I think you do more by education than anything else.
Yeah, education was important not only with our community, but with law enforcement, with healthcare, all of the organizations who either didn't know it, didn't believe it was here, right? Iowa Nice is a big reason why human trafficking is so prevalent here, is because we as Iowans, at least up until now, we might be losing that a little bit now with our growth, but people just couldn't believe that an Iowan would do that to another Iowan, right? Iowa Nice. And so our inability to see it because we just couldn't believe it, was something we had to overcome. And education in the beginning was most of what I did.
Yeah. Well, this has been a wonderful interview, and I Kelly, I can say that what you've done the last 10 years, I think you were obviously called to do that, because that's a task that just not anybody can do.
Yeah, it was divine inspiration. I mean, it was beams of sunlight and the whole deal, because that was not what I was on a path to go do. Yeah. So, yes. But when I look back on it, every skill that I gathered in the first 2 careers of my life prepared me for it.
I think that's a great point that I want to stress to our listener, the achiever, is that everything builds on each other. You look back on your lives, your careers, everything builds on where you're going next.
Right. And it's not an accident.
It's not an accident, and you got to be conscious of it. And I think that's a big part of it, is being conscious of when it's happening and how it's growing you.
Right.
And so I appreciate you telling your story today.
Thanks
I really
very much.
That,
it's fun. Talk about it a little differently.
Yeah, this is great. Something I love you talking about learning, earning, and returning.
Yeah.
What a great words to live by.
Yeah.
Do it all the time.
That's right.
And you probably tell yourself that all the time too. Talk to yourself.
Well, the lifetime learner thing, right? In order to prepare myself to do what I do, I read everything. Right. I probably read the DSM-5, right, to understand behavioral health. I didn't know anything about the mental health conditions that we would be walking into. And we work with the sickest people in our community. And to not be afraid of that, you have to educate yourself. And you have to have experience, right? You have to walk through it. When we opened our doors, I lived in the house for 6 months. And in order to not be afraid of it, to know what I was hiring people to do, and to feel like I could keep people safe.
That's fantastic.
That is.
You know, a couple takeaways that I want to share from today is you talked about you have to understand who you are before you can talk about what you do.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good realization that we all need to have is who are we? And then because our career, our job doesn't define us. It's much bigger than that.
Yeah.
And so who you are is more important than what you do.
And it's so important in how you do what you do.
Absolutely.
What kind of leader you are, what kind of friend you are. It's so much more important.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Any other takeaways, Paul, you want to share?
I'd say, Kelly, I really appreciate you coming out here. I know your busy schedule, so I taking the time to do this and keep
fun.
up the great work.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Really appreciate you being on our show. And thanks to our Achiever for listening. Make sure you like our show and subscribe and continue to grow and break through the ceilings. That's what we're here to do. And Kelly gave us some great examples of how she has broken through many ceilings and how it's working for her today. So thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful day.